Hi Vlogalogue! So this week we're talking about obesity in children and how that should be dealt with. I kind of settled somewhere with Kevin and Niall on this, especially with Niall's conversation, well, what he did mention of the conversation about children with obesity is that it becomes more of a personal related issue. I don't know how much of it we can hold accountable or how much of it we can necessarily blame the parents, though I guess in some aspect you kind of can. Especially like when we talked, like when Alex brought up the idea that part of the problem was how cheap the foods that tend to help lead to obesity are, whereas whereas some of the healthier stuff is more expensive. Part of that depends on how you are as a consumer and your idea of spending money and the value of how you're buying your food, which is something I've been taught since like high school with all my economics classes, as well as just like through watching my parents buy and the habits I learned from them and stuff. And that's definitely part of it, but I also think part of it also has to do with the kind of culture and society we live in, with the way the food goes and the way we consume food, and like that fast food places started for a large part in the United States in this idea that you don't have to cook at home, and the kind of way that has impacted the lifestyle of a lot of Americans. And I say this because of perspectives I've been given from other countries where fast food has started to take place, and countries that were used to making food at home and tended to have healthier habits have slowly been changing because of the introduction of fast food places. But I also think part of it comes down to also what Kevin was saying and his suggestion of education, because of the way that the food pyramid has been constantly changing, and these suggested guidelines are so different and keep changing because of the way lifestyles keep changing and the way we're trying to keep up with and constantly learning about how the human body functions and what it needs necessarily. So we're constantly changing our understanding, which is changing the way things should be. So it's hard to place parents on keeping up with all of these things consistently, along with maintaining like a daily job and being aware of their own things and taking care of their own problems while at the same time looking after their kids. But I think one of the things, and I don't know whether or not Alex brought it up, but I feel like he did, I think one of the other problems when looking at whether or not this should be taken as something of considered like a child abuse or child neglect, I think would probably be more apt than child abuse. The other thing is a genetic aspect and how much of it is like a metabolic issue and like just genetics, and the fact that there are certain cases in which kids tend to get obese or something because of a condition they have, and it's more of a result of that, and the parents are trying to work at that underlying issue rather than focusing on the obesity. Though I think a lot of it, and a reason part of why we see it, is kind of the sedentary lifestyle that we start seeing. I think after Alex, Niles, and my generation all kind of being in the same boat, like after our generation, I think is when it really hit this sort of thing, like watching kids grow up now where you see them a lot more on the computer and on cell phones and on any form of technology, where you didn't see it as much before. Like with us, we had it developing, but we still had an interest in the outdoors, and I think, though it's kind of a generalization, you see it a lot more, especially as we get cases where we've heard about kids getting carpal tunnel because they're on technology so much. And it's just this change and adaptation of lifestyle that we see as a culture and kind of as a world society, that as things change, we're still trying to catch up to the change and adjusting what needs to be adjusted as we discover that's the problem. And I think we're still in that case of adjusting and trying to figure out how to make all the pieces still work and still have a healthy lifestyle with that. And I think one of the other things that needs to be talked about is just kind of like the way that it tends to go with having obesity in children. Certainly there are a lot of health risks with children being obese, and the kind of lifestyle and precedent it sort of is believed to set. But there's also this manner in which we hear a lot more, and you kind of see it a lot more, in which a child may be obese in childhood but then grows out of it, or maybe not even necessarily. It's all not a case-by-case type of thing, and it always changes, but I think it's really hard to try and blame parents for necessarily what may not be their fault when they're trying to be healthier with their kids. I think it's just a really hard thing to try and police parents about that, because then it becomes a question of other things. And I think one of the interesting things is like whether or not you think parents who are vegan or vegetarian should be enforcing that lifestyle on their children and how they're fed, because then I think if you're gonna start looking at children with obesity, it might open up that conversation more, because I know I've met a few friends who were raised in a vegetarian lifestyle, some of which who were maybe in like a divorced parent situation where in one household they were allowed to eat meat and the other they weren't, and they enjoyed meat, so they didn't take on the vegetarian lifestyle as they were older, or if they had like were with just a solitary parent or with both parents and it was a vegetarian lifestyle and they grew up in it, and so they have stayed in it because that was the lifestyle they were raised in. And while a vegetarian lifestyle definitely seems to be one of the more healthier options, of whether or not that's the kind of lifestyle you have to indoctrinate, sort of almost seeming like it's indoctrinated into the child rather than giving them the choice of discovering it like in their teenage years or as they get older if they prefer not to eat meat in this kind of way. And I think that's just a conversation that gets opened up when you talk about whether or not parents should be held accountable for the weight of their children. And I mean, every year we always hear stories of on Halloween about the neighbor who like this past year, about the neighbor in like Illinois or Ohio or something like that, who wouldn't hand candy out to obese children, and the kind of impact that had on the kids, and like for them to like not get candy but a slip of paper, and I don't even think they got like a healthier snack, which I think was probably a better alternative. I had neighbors who were diabetic, so instead of handing out candy to kids every year because they couldn't keep any excess candy around them, they hand out like a bag of popcorn. Or like other families who like hand out like other things that are slightly healthy but still kind of just like a decent treat to kids on Halloween, which I think is a better approach if you don't want to be handing out candy and having it be a blanket approach than rather just targeting obese children. Kevin also had a very good point with his mentioning of, do we really want to bring this to the government, to police, when they're bad enough about it in their own right? When looking at school lunches, I mean, we already see criticisms that have been faced with Michelle Obama's change in what's considered healthy food and whatnot, and the attacks she's gotten over Twitter with these school lunches that are basically smaller portions of food that's still bad for them, and them getting less to eat because the school would rather spend the money on the food that's not good for them and give them smaller portions of it so it's considered healthier, rather than buy food that's actually good for them in a decent quantity so they still have a decent sized lunch. Or the fact that, you know, pizza is considered a vegetable because of the tomato sauce type thing, of if the government is still trying to work and figure out how to properly feed kids through the school lunch system, how can we expect them to try to police what parents feed their kids, in the sense that how it can possibly lead to obesity. Whereas it's something a lot different to criticize a parent for feeding their kids something that will have these long-term effects if they are obese and they stay in that lifestyle because of how they were raised, on what they eat and their eating habits and whatnot, as opposed to if they were the parent that neglected to feed their child for days and put them in danger. I think that's about all I have. Those are my 2 cents on the subject. I think there are a lot of other issues within child obesity and obesity in general, because we do face it not only with children but with adults, that it's a lot harder to police, put any kind of regulations on them and have it be successful and have the impact that we intend. And I think a lot of it comes down to educating people about basic things and a lot more about what leads to the type of things that do lead to an unhealthy lifestyle, and how to sort of begin to switch it out. So until next week, Vlogalogue. Bye.